My name is Sienna Enright, and I am 31 years old. Right now, it is 7:14 p.m. on a Friday. The line in my kitchen is running at 92 degrees. My father, Richard, is standing in the swinging doorway, blocking my path to the dining room. He is adjusting his tie and speaking in a harsh whisper, instructing me to stay hidden back here with the dishwashers so my younger sister Chloe can finish charming the venture capitalist sitting at table 4. 10 minutes from now, I will take off this stained apron. I will walk out the back door into the alley, get in my car, and drive away. And then that investor, the man my family does not realize already knows exactly who I am, will stand up in the center of the dining room and tear a finalized $5 million term sheet into pieces right in front of them. Before I take you through exactly how we got here, please take a second to like and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life. Drop your age, your city, and your local time in the comments below. I always love seeing who is listening and where you are tuning in from. Now, let me take you back 14 months. The conference room at Ellis & Vance Law smelt like lemon polish and old paper. I sat across from a notary public and a commercial real estate broker who kept checking his watch. On the mahogany table sat a stack of documents 3 inches thick. I did not blink as I signed my name on the final line of the deed. For 3 years, the brick building at 402 West Elm had sat vacant. It was a distressed mixed-use property, a gutted retail space on the ground floor and a dusty, exposed brick loft upstairs. To the neighborhood, it was a liability. To me, it was a math equation. When my maternal grandmother passed away 2 years prior, she did not leave her estate to my parents. She left a trust of $312,000 directly to me. She always told me I was the only one in the family who understood the value of a dollar earned rather than a dollar demanded. I did not buy a car. I did not take a vacation. I hired an attorney and formed a blind LLC called Ironclad Holdings. With a cashier's check, I bought the Elm Street building outright. No mortgage, no partners. I owned the brick, the copper wiring, the foundation, and the roof. I spent the next 14 months turning the ground floor into the heirloom, a farm-to-table concept I designed from the ground up. I laid the subway tile in the kitchen myself. I sourced the local vendors. I built the menu. I moved into the upstairs apartment, living out of cardboard boxes while I funneled every dime of revenue back into the restaurant. My family knew I worked there. They knew I was the executive chef. What I never told them was that I owned the building. My father, a man who has spent his entire life taking credit for other people's work, loved the idea of his daughter running a successful kitchen. He loved the prestige. He loved inviting his friends in for free meals. But Richard Enright could never stand not being the man in charge. So he decided he was going to run the business side of things, inserting himself as a consultant despite having 0 hospitality experience. I let him play the role because it kept him out of my kitchen. I did not realize that giving him an inch of perceived power would lead him to try and take my home. The illusion of his authority started small. He would reorganize my office. He would change the supplier orders without telling me. Then he started bringing my siblings into the fold. My sister Chloe, an aspiring influencer whose primary talent was taking pictures of my plated dishes, appointed herself the social media manager. I let it slide. The restaurant was netting a 22% profit margin, and I was too busy managing the line to care about internet tags. But the real issue was my younger brother, Mason. At 26, Mason was the textbook definition of a golden child. He had just burned through his 3rd tech startup, a company funded entirely by my parents' second mortgage. Mason did not have a job, a car, or a place to live. And in my family, Mason's problems were always everyone else's emergencies. Which brings us to a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the investor dinner. I was in the prep kitchen, breaking down a side of beef when my father walked in. He did not say hello. He did not ask how service went the night before. He just stood by the walk-in cooler, cleared his throat, and told me we were having a mandatory family meeting. I wiped my hands on a towel and followed him out to the dining room. My mother, Patricia, was sitting at a corner booth, staring into a cup of black coffee. Mason was sprawled across the banquette, scrolling on his phone. I sat down opposite them. My father remained standing, pacing the length of the table like a courtroom lawyer. He announced that Mason was going through a transition period. He said Mason needed a stable environment to get his next venture off the ground, a place where he could focus without the burden of rent. My father stopped pacing, placed his hands flat on the table, and looked down at me. He told me I would be vacating my upstairs apartment by the end of the month. I stared at him. I asked him where exactly he expected me to go. He did not miss a beat. He said I could rent a studio across town, or perhaps find a roommate. He said my commute would be a bit longer, but it was a sacrifice I needed to make. Then he delivered the line I had heard my entire life. Family takes care of family, Sienna. Do not be selfish. He said it as a command, not a request. I looked at my mother. She kept her eyes glued to her coffee mug. I looked at Mason. He did not even look up from his screen. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not tell them that Mason was moving his life into a building where he had zero legal right to exist. I just nodded once, stood up, and walked back into the kitchen. I picked up my knife and went back to the beef. But in my head, I was already dialing my real estate attorney. The stainless steel prep table was cold under my palms. I stood there for a long time after walking away from that table in the dining room. I picked up my boning knife. The blade was exactly 6 inches long, forged carbon steel, sharpened to a razor edge every Sunday night. I pulled the side of beef closer and made the first incision along the rib bone. The restaurant was quiet, save for the hum of the walk-in compressor. I needed the quiet to process the sheer audacity of what my father had just demanded. He wanted my apartment. He wanted the space I had slept in on an air mattress for 6 months while the plumbing was being permitted. He wanted the home I built with my grandmother's inheritance, and he wanted it for Mason. I separated the chuck from the brisket. Let me explain how Mason operates. My brother does not make mistakes. He experiences cosmic injustices. At 22, he launched a delivery app that burned through $85,000 of our parents' retirement savings in 4 months. He blamed the market. At 24, he started a boutique marketing agency. My father took out a second mortgage on his own house to fund the office space. Mason signed a 5-year commercial lease, bought imported leather chairs, hired his fraternity brothers, and declared bankruptcy 9 months later. He blamed the local economy. Now, at 26, his third venture, a cryptocurrency exchange platform, had collapsed before it even launched. The investors pulled out. The debt collectors started calling my parents' house. And once again, my father decided that the consequences of Mason's actions were my responsibility to absorb. The swinging door to the kitchen pushed open. It was my mother, Patricia. She carried her empty coffee mug, her eyes darting nervously around the stainless steel appliances like she was trespassing. In a way, she was. She walked over to the sink, rinsed her mug, and stood there drying her hands on a paper towel for far too long. She cleared her throat. She said she knew it was a sudden request. She said she knew I loved my little space upstairs, but Mason was in a very dark place. He owed a lot of people a lot of money. The stress was eating him alive. She looked at me, pleading with her eyes. She said I was strong, I was capable, I always figured things out. Mason, she explained, was delicate. He needed a sanctuary to rebuild his confidence. I kept my eyes on the cutting board. I asked her if Mason's confidence required exposed brick and a newly renovated kitchen. I asked her why he could not sleep in his childhood bedroom at their house. My mother sighed, a long practiced sound of martyrdom. She said my father had already converted Mason's old room into a home gym. She said having Mason back at the house would cause too much friction. What she meant was that they did not want to deal with the mess they had created. It was easier to displace me than to face their son. She stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. She used that soft, placating voice she always used right before asking me to carry a burden that was not mine. Just for 6 months, Sienna. Just until he gets back on his feet. You can afford a nice place. You are doing so well here. Do not make your father angry. You know how he gets. I stepped back, letting her hand fall from my shoulder. I told her I had to finish prepping for dinner service. She nodded, her face falling, and quietly pushed back through the swinging doors. 10 minutes later, Mason walked in. He did not look like a man whose life had just fallen apart. He wore a crisp linen shirt and expensive sneakers. He strolled through my kitchen, picking a piece of fresh basil off the garnish tray and chewing it. He looked around the space with a proprietary gaze. He did not say thank you. He did not apologize for uprooting my life. Instead, he asked me if the load-bearing wall upstairs could be knocked down. I stopped cutting. I looked at him. He explained that the apartment felt a bit closed off. He said he wanted an open-concept floor plan for his new home office. He thought removing the wall between the bedroom and the living area would improve the natural light. He said our father already agreed to look into the permits. He told me to make sure my boxes were packed by the 28th, so the contractors could get in before the 1st of the month. Then he asked me to make him a sandwich and walked out. I did not throw the knife. I did not scream. I washed my hands in the prep sink, scrubbing the grease from under my fingernails with water so hot it turned my skin red. I dried my hands, walked to my office, and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. My family operated under a fatal assumption. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was compliant. They mistook my discipline for submission. But they forgot that I ran a business. I managed vendor contracts, health department codes, and payroll for 22 employees. I did not operate on emotion. I operated on documentation. I opened a new tab and navigated to the Illinois General Assembly website. I clicked on Chapter 735, the Code of Civil Procedure. I scrolled down to Article 9, Eviction. I spent the next 2 hours reading every single statute regarding tenant rights, commercial leases, and squatter eviction processes in the state of Illinois. I printed the forms. I read the case law regarding verbal agreements and illegal lockouts. My father was operating under the delusion that he held a master commercial lease for the entire building. He believed that piece of paper gave him the authority to act as a landlord. He believed he could simply dictate my living situation because he had bullied a fake title out of a broker. He did not know that the broker worked for Ironclad Holdings. He did not know that Ironclad Holdings was me. He was trying to evict the owner of the building using a piece of paper that was legally worthless. I opened my email and drafted a message to Marcus Vance, my real estate attorney. I attached a summary of the morning's conversation. I detailed Mason's intent to occupy the residential unit on the second floor without a signed lease, without a security deposit, and without my consent. I requested Marcus to prepare a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to quit, addressed not to me, but to Richard Enright, invalidating his entire claim to the property. I hit send. The trap was not just set, it was primed. My family wanted to play a game of real estate. They wanted to use my sanctuary to house their golden child. I was going to let them pack their bags. I was going to let Mason pick out his paint colors. I was going to let my father print his fake construction permits. I would give them exactly enough rope to doom themselves financially and legally. I stood up, unlocked my office door, and went back to the kitchen. It was time to start dinner service. And it was time to let my father seal his own fate. To understand why my father thought he could evict me, you have to understand the fiction he constructed 14 months ago. When I first secured the property on Elm Street, Richard insisted on handling the commercial paperwork. He told my mother I was a talented cook, but a naive girl who would easily be manipulated by corporate landlords. He did not know I was the landlord. I needed a buffer to maintain my anonymity, so I hired a local real estate broker named David to act as the face of Ironclad Holdings. I instructed David to arrange a formal meeting with my father to discuss the tenancy terms for the building. My father wore his best charcoal suit to that meeting. He sat in a downtown coffee shop, ordered a sparkling water, and spent 2 hours aggressively negotiating the terms of a master lease. He demanded a 10-year agreement covering both the ground floor restaurant space and the residential unit upstairs. He argued for fixed rent. He demanded the right to sublet. David simply nodded, agreed to every demand, and slid a 60-page draft across the table. My father signed the final page with a gold fountain pen. He took his unratified copy, shook David by the hand, and walked out feeling like a titan of industry. He drove straight to my apartment, dropped the thick folder on my coffee table, and announced he had secured our future. He told me he was the master tenant, the guarantor, the man shielding me from the ruthless real estate market. What Richard never bothered to check was the signature line next to his own. David took the original document back to my attorney. Ironclad Holdings never countersigned it. We never ratified the agreement. The lease was a phantom. But my father filed his copy in a fireproof safe in his home office, fully convinced that his signature alone gave him dominion over the entire property. He operated under the assumption that he held the keys to the kingdom. That piece of paper was the foundation of his arrogance. He used it to justify taking a percentage of the restaurant profits as a management fee. He used it to dictate the hours of operation. And now he was using it to hand my home to Mason. 2 days after the family meeting in the dining room, the lunch rush had just ended. I was standing at the stainless steel pass, filtering 50 quarts of veal stock. The kitchen was 85 degrees. The exhaust hoods hummed a low, constant note. The back door swung open, letting in a draft of humid city air. My father walked in. He wore a crisp golf shirt and held a clipboard. He did not check in with the front-of-house staff. He bypassed the prep cooks and walked straight to my station. He stood there, watching me lift the heavy stock pot, waiting for me to acknowledge his presence. I set the pot down and picked up a skimming ladle. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. He mentioned he had not seen any moving boxes by the back stairwell. He stated that the end of the month was approaching rapidly and contractors were lined up to begin the wall demolition for Mason. I kept my eyes on the stock. I informed him that packing took time. I told him running a kitchen for 14 hours a day left very little room for moving logistics. My father sighed. It was the heavy, burdened sigh of a man dealing with an insubordinate employee. He leaned against the metal counter, invading my workspace. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of forced patience. He told me I was dragging my feet. He said he understood I was attached to the space, but my resistance was becoming a problem for the family. Then he delivered the threat he had been holding in his back pocket. He reminded me that he held the master lease for the building. He stated that he legally controlled the restaurant footprint. He looked around the kitchen, pointing his pen at the imported ovens and the pristine tile work I had installed with my own hands. He said he would hate to revoke my kitchen privileges. He said there were dozens of qualified executive chefs in the city looking for a flagship restaurant. He suggested that if I could not be a team player regarding Mason, he would have no choice but to bring in a new chef by Tuesday. He was threatening to fire me from my own business. He was threatening to lock me out of the building I owned, using a piece of paper that held no legal weight. I stopped skimming the stock. I looked at the pen in his hand, then up at his face. He held a smug, confident expression. He believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to apologize, to promise I would pack my bags tonight, to acknowledge him as the ultimate authority in my life. I did not give him the satisfaction. I placed the ladle on a folded towel. I looked him dead in the eye and nodded. I told him I understood his position. I told him I would have my personal belongings boxed up by the weekend. His smug expression softened into a patronizing smile. He patted my shoulder. He said he knew I would eventually see reason. He told me to keep up the good work on the menu, turned around, and walked out the back door. I watched the heavy metal door swing shut. I picked up the ladle and finished skimming the fat from the surface of the stock. My pulse remained steady. I walked into my office, closed the door, and dialed Marcus Vance. Marcus answered on the second ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I asked him to pull the Ironclad Holdings file. I asked him to verify the legal status of Richard Enright. Marcus pulled the records. He confirmed what I already knew. Richard had zero equity in the business. His name was not on the liquor license. His name was not on the vendor contracts. And the commercial lease in his safe was a unilateral proposal that had expired 12 months ago. Legally, Richard was not even a month-to-month tenant. He was a guest. I instructed Marcus to draft the 30-day notice to quit. I told him to explicitly cite the lack of a ratified lease agreement. I told him to address it directly to Richard and Mason Enright, demanding the immediate cessation of any planned construction and the vacation of any property located at 402 West Elm. Marcus warned me that delivering a formal legal notice would detonate my family dynamic permanently. He asked if I was prepared for the fallout. I looked through the glass window of my office, watching my line cooks prep for the dinner service. I thought about the sweat I poured into those floors. I told Marcus to print the notice on heavy cardstock and keep it in his desk until I gave the signal. The trap was fully armed regarding the apartment. But while I was fortifying the physical building, another quiet war was starting in the dining room. My sister had found a different kind of leverage, and she was preparing to steal the only thing my father had not claimed. It was Thursday afternoon. I stood by the espresso machine on the ground floor, listening to the ceiling. Above my head, heavy footsteps paced back and forth across the hardwood. Mason was upstairs in my apartment. He had brought a laser measuring tool. I could hear the distinct, rhythmic beeps of the device mapping out my living room dimensions. He was measuring the walls to order a custom shelving unit for his home office. The physical space of my life was being dismantled floorboard by floorboard. But while my brother was invading my home, a much more dangerous invasion was happening quietly in the digital space. My family had launched a two-front war. My sister Chloe is 28 years old. Her entire career consists of curating a lifestyle she cannot afford to maintain. When I first opened the Heirloom, she offered to run the social media accounts. I agreed because her services cost me nothing out of pocket. In the beginning, she simply took photos of my plated dishes, added filters, and tagged local food critics. It seemed harmless. But as the restaurant gained traction and the reservations booked out weeks in advance, her online narrative began to shift. She started posting pictures of herself standing in the empty dining room before service. She wore tailored suits and held a clipboard. Her captions began incorporating phrases like "my vision," "my team," and "my culinary journey." I ignored it. I was working 90-hour weeks managing a kitchen staff, sourcing organic produce, and balancing the ledger. I did not care who received the superficial credit on the internet as long as the tables remained full and the checks cleared. That indifference was a mistake. The Heirloom was no longer just a popular neighborhood spot. We had hit a 22% profit margin by the end of our first year. That specific number is practically unheard of in the modern hospitality industry. It is the kind of metric that attracts serious institutional money. It attracted Julian Pierce. Julian is a high-profile venture capitalist based out of New York. His firm specializes in identifying single-location independent restaurants with high scalability. He buys into the concept, injects massive capital, and turns them into national syndicates. He was actively looking for his next flagship investment. He sent a formal inquiry to the general contact address listed on our public website. That email address was programmed to forward directly to the master server located in my locked office. I usually reviewed the administrative inbox every Sunday morning before the vendors arrived. But that weekend, my lead prep cook called out sick, forcing me to cover his shift. I did not log into the terminal until late Tuesday night. The kitchen was dark. The exhaust hoods were powered down. The only light came from the glow of my monitor. I sorted the master inbox by unread messages. I scrolled past the supplier invoices and the reservation requests. Then, I found a thread containing 42 replies. The sender was Julian Pierce. The recipient was Chloe. I clicked on the oldest message. Julian had reached out, requesting a preliminary phone call with the founder of the restaurant. Chloe had replied within 10 minutes. She introduced herself as the creator, owner, and sole visionary behind the heirloom. She told him the entire farm-to-table concept was her personal brainchild. I sat in the silent office and read through the chain, watching my own sister systematically erase my existence from my own company. Julian asked detailed questions about the menu development. Chloe responded by sending him a secure PDF containing my proprietary recipes. She claimed she had spent months perfecting the hydration ratio of the sourdough and the brining process for the short ribs in her home kitchen. Those recipes took me 4 years of trial and error to finalize. She handed them over in a keystroke. Then, Julian asked about labor costs and kitchen management. Chloe provided a fabricated breakdown of the staff. She referred to me by my first name. She wrote that Sienna was a reliable hired line cook brought in to execute her vision. She assured the investor that while I was good with a knife, I lacked the business acumen to handle a national expansion. It was not just vanity driving her, it was a calculated, federal crime. Julian requested preliminary financial statements to justify a potential $5 million capitalization check. Chloe did not have access to my actual accounting software or my bank portals, so she manufactured the data. She created elaborate spreadsheets using estimated revenue numbers. She forged my father's signature as a corporate guarantor. She submitted these fraudulent documents across state lines to a registered financial institution. She was no longer just lying for social media validation. She was committing wire fraud. She was committing intellectual property theft. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained entirely still on the keyboard. I felt a cold, metallic anger settle deep in my stomach. A less disciplined person would have marched out to the dining room the next morning, confronted her in front of the staff, and demanded her phone. A less disciplined person would have screamed. I did not do that. I realized in that dark office that Chloe was handing me the ultimate weapon. I opened a new browser window. I logged into my encrypted legal folder. I downloaded the entire email thread. I saved the forged financial spreadsheets. I archived the stolen recipe documents. I cross-referenced the timestamps of her emails with my own original draft files to establish undeniable, chronological proof of the theft. I forwarded every single piece of correspondence to Marcus Vance, my attorney. I typed a one-line directive. Hold all of this until I give the word. I wanted her to keep talking. Every subsequent email she sent to Julian Pierce was another nail securing her fate. Every lie she told him increased the severity of the impending civil and criminal action. She was building a house of cards on a foundation of federal offenses, and she believed she was untouchable. I closed the email server. I wiped the terminal search history. I turned off the monitor and walked out of the office. The next morning, Chloe walked into the kitchen wearing a designer trench coat and holding a cup of artisan coffee. She leaned against the stainless steel prep counter, interrupting my staff meeting. She announced that we needed to prepare a special, off-menu tasting for next Friday. She said a very important hospitality reviewer was flying into the city specifically to see her. She looked directly at me. She told me not to mess up the plating. She instructed me to follow her recipes exactly as written. I looked at her. I did not blink. I nodded my head. I told her I would follow the instructions to the letter. She smiled a bright, victorious smile, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a trap door. She turned on her heel and walked back to the dining room to plan her $5 million lie. And as she walked away, I heard the heavy thud of cardboard hitting the floorboards upstairs. Mason was officially moving in. The walls were closing in on them, and they were the ones pushing. The first Monday of the month arrived, with a heavy, overcast sky. The morning light filtered through the industrial windows of my loft, casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I was standing by the kitchen island, drinking a glass of water, when the heavy footsteps started up the metal staircase. The door pushed open. My father walked in carrying a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. He dropped them onto the floorboards. The impact produced a sickening hollow thud that echoed against the exposed brick. He dusted off his hands and looked around the room, assessing the space not as a home, but as an asset he had successfully acquired. Mason trailed in behind him, holding an iced latte. He bypassed me entirely and walked straight to the center of the living area. He began examining the walls. I had painted those walls a soft, matte sage green when I first moved in. It took me 3 weekends of climbing a ladder between dinner shifts to finish the trim. Mason frowned, tracing a finger along the baseboard. He announced that the color was depressing. He told my father he needed a bright, stark white to maximize his productivity. He said the green would absorb the natural light and interfere with the glare on his dual monitors. This was classic Mason. When we were children, my parents repainted his bedroom 3 separate times because he claimed the shades of blue gave him visual fatigue. He always required a perfectly curated environment to justify his inevitable failures. Now, he was curating my living room. He pulled out his phone and started typing, noting the dimensions for his custom standing desk and his ergonomic chair. My father pointed to the stack of cardboard. He informed me that the moving truck for Mason was booked for Wednesday morning. He said I needed to have the space cleared by Tuesday night so the cleaning crew could prep the floors. He spoke with the clipped, efficient cadence of a project manager coordinating a site turnover. I set my water glass down on the island. I walked over to the stack of boxes. I picked up the first one, unfolded the flaps, and pressed them flat. I picked up a heavy-duty tape dispenser. The sharp tearing sound of the packing tape ripping across the cardboard was the only answer I gave him. I packed exactly 14 boxes. I did not pack in a frenzy. I packed with surgical precision. I started with my personal library, culinary textbooks, business ledgers, thick volumes on regional agriculture. I placed them flat, distributing the weight evenly. Then I moved to the kitchen. I picked up my grandmother's cast iron skillet. The metal was heavy and cold. I stood there in the fading light of the apartment, staring at the black iron. For 5 seconds, the surgical precision faltered. I gripped the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white, letting the quiet ache of what my family was doing to me settle in my chest. Then I let out a single, slow breath. I placed the skillet into the box, burying the grief under the cardboard flaps, and forced the discipline back into my hands. I packed my Japanese steel knives, wrapping each blade in the thick canvas roll. I left the heavy appliances. They stayed because I own them, and they belonged to the property. My father stood near the doorway, watching me work. He crossed his arms over his chest. He offered a tight, approving nod. He said he was proud of me. He said I was finally acting like a team player. He used those exact corporate buzzwords to sanitize the reality of what was happening. He told me that maturity was recognizing when the family unit required individual sacrifice. He said Mason would remember this favor when his new venture took off. I felt the familiar, cold sting of parental betrayal. It was a physical sensation, a tight knot resting right beneath my ribs. A father was standing in his daughter's home, watching her dismantle her life and calling it a victory. He was displacing his hard-working child to provide a free sanctuary for his lazy son. But the sting was brief. It was immediately neutralized by the cold, hard facts resting inside my locked filing cabinet. I walked into the bedroom and approached the heavy, fireproof steel cabinet. It held my tax returns, my vendor contracts, and the original deed to the building at 402 West Elm. It held the unratified lease. It held the drafted 30-day notice to quit. I locked the top drawer, pocketed the key, and tilted the cabinet onto a hand truck. I rolled the hand truck past my father and Mason. I stopped near the front door. Mason was busy measuring the window frames for blackout curtains. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single silver key attached to a plain metal ring. I held it out to him. Mason stopped measuring. He looked at the key, then at me. He took it. The cold metal transferred from my hand to his. He did not say thank you. He did not acknowledge the weight of the gesture. He simply slipped it into his pocket and turned his attention back to the windows, remarking that the current blinds were too industrial for his taste. I did not correct him. I did not tell him that his taste did not matter. Over the next 48 hours, I moved those 14 boxes and the steel cabinet to a secure, climate-controlled storage facility on the edge of the city. I paid for 6 months in cash. I signed the rental agreement, locked the steel door of Unit 408, and walked away. I secured a temporary room at an extended stay hotel 2 miles from the restaurant. On Tuesday night, I returned to the apartment for the final sweep. The space was empty. I had scrubbed the baseboards. I wiped down the counter surfaces with an industrial degreaser. I swept the hardwood floors until they gleamed under the overhead lights. I applied the concept of empty space, leaving no trace of my existence behind. The apartment was pristine. It was a blank canvas waiting for its new occupant. I stood at the threshold, my hand resting on the doorknob. Tomorrow morning, a moving truck would pull up to the curb. Mason would direct a team of hired laborers to carry his expensive mattress, his imported leather sofa, and his dual monitor setup up these stairs. He would unpack his clothes into the closet I built. He would stock the refrigerator I bought. He would establish his roots, spread out his belongings, and claim his new territory. My mother would probably bring him housewarming groceries. My father would probably bring a bottle of champagne to celebrate the new chapter. They believed they had won. They believed they had successfully bullied me out of my own territory through the sheer force of family guilt. They did not understand the gravity of their mistake. Mason was moving his entire life, his expensive furniture, and his delicate workflow into a building where he possessed zero legal standing. He was not a tenant, he was not a guest. The moment he crossed that threshold with his belongings, he became a hostile trespasser on a commercial property owned by Ironclad Holdings. I closed the door. The lock clicked shut. The physical eviction was complete. The trap upstairs was fully loaded and waiting to snap. I walked down the metal staircase to the ground floor, my boots ringing against the steel grates. The quiet preparation was over. It was time to focus on the dining room. Because while Mason was busy measuring the walls upstairs, Chloe was busy trying to sell my restaurant. And Julian Pierce was scheduled to arrive for dinner on Friday night. I pushed through the swinging doors into my kitchen, tied a fresh apron around my waist, and began to prep the short ribs. The real performance was about to begin. Friday night arrived. The air inside the heirloom was thick with the smell of roasting garlic and wood smoke. We were operating at our maximum legal capacity of 85 patrons. Every table was full. The wait list stretched into November. The stakes for this evening were staggering. A $5 million capitalization check sat inside the leather portfolio of Julian Pierce, the venture capitalist who had just walked through the front doors. Through the rectangular glass window of the kitchen pass, I watched the performance begin in the dining room. Chloe stood near the host stand. She wore an emerald silk dress that cost $900. I recognized the designer. She bought it on Tuesday using a credit card tied to our parents' second mortgage. Chloe possessed a unique talent for adopting unearned authority. Growing up, she was the child who handed out the programs at piano recitals and somehow managed to accept the applause. Tonight, she was applying that same skill to my business. She greeted Julian Pierce with a rehearsed smile, introducing herself as the founder and executive visionary of the restaurant. My father stood 2 steps behind her, playing the role of the proud patriarch. Richard wore a crisp charcoal suit. He shook Julian's hand with both of his own, a classic salesman tactic designed to project dominance. For 30 years, my father ran a local hardware store where he measured success by the number of friendly conversations he had over the checkout counter. He believed those exact metrics translated to high finance. He gestured expansively across the dining room, pointing out the reclaimed wood ceiling and the custom lighting fixtures as if he had drawn the blueprints himself. The contrast between the dining room and the kitchen was stark. Out there, they sipped sparkling water and discussed profit margins they did not understand. Back here, the line was running at 92 degrees. The ticket machine chattered without stopping. I stood at the expediter station, managing a crew of 6 line cooks. We operated in a state of synchronized motion. There was no shouting. There was only the sound of searing meat, the clatter of metal pans, and sharp, concise calls for timing. I was preparing the final component for Table 4. Table 4 was Julian Pierce. The order was my signature dish, a 48-hour braised Wagyu short rib. Developing this single menu item took me 6 months of continuous testing. The process required a precise mathematical formula. The meat was seared in beef tallow at 400 degrees, then submerged in a reduction of local red wine, root vegetables, and bone broth. It cooked in a thermal immersion circulator at exactly 137 degrees for 2 straight days. The result was a texture that defied standard culinary expectations. It was the specific dish Julian Pierce had requested in his emails to Chloe. The dish she claimed she invented in her home kitchen. I pulled the vacuum-sealed bag from the water bath. I sliced it open, the rich steam filling my station. I placed the meat onto the cutting board. It yielded instantly under my knife. The heavy swinging doors pushed open. My father stepped into the kitchen, dabbed his forehead. He hated the kitchen. He hated the heat, the noise, and the grease that threatened to ruin his dry cleaning. He bypassed the dishwashing station and walked directly to my counter. He looked at the plated short rib, then looked at me. He leaned in close, lowering his voice so the prep cooks could not hear. He told me the pitch was going perfectly. He said Julian was fascinated by Chloe's vision for national expansion. Then he delivered his primary instruction. He ordered me to stay out of sight. He told me that investors wanted to see polished executives, not sweaty cooks. He instructed me to remain behind the kitchen doors until the dining room cleared out. He said Chloe was closing the deal of a lifetime, and he could not risk me walking out there and ruining her big moment with my stained apron and my lack of corporate polish. He reminded me of my place. He was standing on hardwood floors that I purchased. He was breathing air circulated by an HVAC system that I permitted. He was dictating terms inside a building registered under my LLC. He treated me like a disposable peasant trespassing in my own castle. I did not stop working. I picked up a pair of titanium plating tweezers. I carefully arranged a garnish of pickled shallots and micro mustard greens across the top of the Wagyu beef. I wiped the rim of the heavy porcelain plate with a damp towel, ensuring it was spotless. I looked at my father. I told him I understood his instructions perfectly. I assured him I would not interrupt Chloe while she explained her culinary vision to the investor. My father smiled. It was a brief, patronizing curve of his lips. He patted my shoulder, told me to keep pushing the tickets, and turned around. He pushed back through the swinging doors, returning to the air-conditioned comfort of his stolen stage. I stood alone at the pass. I set the tweezers down on the stainless steel counter. The kitchen continued to hum around me, a machine of my own creation. I picked up a clean white rag and wiped my hands, removing the grease and the au jus from my fingers. I looked up at the digital clock mounted above the walk-in cooler. It read 7:42. The short rib was plated. The trap was fully primed. My family had constructed a towering monument to their own vanity, placing themselves at the very top for Julian Pierce to admire. Their public image had reached its absolute zenith. They had claimed my home. They had claimed my business. They had stolen my identity. I picked up the heavy porcelain plate. It was warm against my palms. I nodded to my sous chef, signaling him to take over the expediter station. I turned my back to the stove and walked toward the swinging doors. It was time to pull the final pin and watch the monument fall. The heavy porcelain plates left the kitchen balanced on the arms of my lead server. I wiped my hands on a clean towel and stood by the glass partition, watching the food make its way across the floor. The dining room was operating at peak volume. 85 patrons engaged in loud conversation over the low hum of background jazz. The server navigated the narrow walkways and approached the center booth. He set the dishes down. The braised Wagyu rested in its dark, glossy reduction, garnished precisely the way I had designed it. Julian Pierce did not reach for his knife. He picked up his heavy silver fork and pressed the tines into the center of the meat. The grain yielded without a fraction of resistance. He lifted the bite to his mouth, tasted it, and closed his eyes for a single second. He was a man who evaluated hundreds of hospitality groups every year. He understood the vast difference between a lucky recipe and disciplined, repeatable culinary execution. He swallowed, set his fork down on the edge of the plate, and leaned forward. The dining portion of his evening was over. The financial audit had officially begun. He looked directly across the table at my sister. He complimented the texture of the braise. Then, without changing his polite tone, he asked her to break down the exact food cost percentage for that specific menu item. Chloe maintained her posture, but I saw her shoulders stiffen. Growing up, my sister survived every academic and social challenge by smiling and changing the subject. If a high school teacher asked about a missing assignment, she complimented their outfit. If our mother asked about a dented car bumper, she feigned a sudden panic attack to garner sympathy. Deflection was her primary survival mechanism. She applied that same strategy to the venture capitalist sitting across from her. She offered Julian a bright, practiced smile. She told him that the true value of the dish was not found in the margins, but in the curated artisan experience. She used the word synergy. She called the menu a holistic journey. She spoke for 60 uninterrupted seconds, waving her hands in graceful gestures, without providing a single numerical figure. Julian watched her. His expression remained entirely neutral. He did not nod along with her rhythm. He waited until she finished her long sentence, let a full 2 seconds of uncomfortable silence pass, and asked the exact same question a second time. He stated that a $5 million valuation required precise arithmetic. He asked what percentage of the $42 retail price went to the meat supply. The smile on my sister's face turned brittle. The gaslighting lexicon she used to control our family dynamic held zero currency at this table. You cannot guilt-trip a balance sheet. You cannot manipulate a profit margin. She shifted in her seat, her hand dropping to her lap. She gripped her linen napkin. She stammered something vague about seasonal market fluctuations and dynamic pricing models. Julian opened a leather-bound notebook he had pulled from his jacket. He clicked his pen. He ignored her stammering and moved to the next item on his list. He asked how she negotiated the vendor contract for the local Wagyu. He specifically wanted to know if she locked in a fixed rate during the spring or if she was buying on a sliding scale based on the regional commodity index. Chloe's hand, suspended in the middle of a graceful gesture, froze entirely in the air. The confident facade snapped. She reached hastily for her crystal water glass. Her fingers trembled so violently that the ice cubes clinked a sharp, frantic rhythm against the rim. She took a shallow sip and set the glass down far too hard, leaving a dark, weeping ring of condensation on the pristine white linen tablecloth. She had no idea what the commodity index was. A red flush crept up her neck as she looked desperately to her right, seeking a lifeline. My father recognized the distress signal. Richard Enright built his local reputation by slapping shoulders and buying rounds of drinks at the country club. He operated on the fundamental belief that a firm handshake and aggressive charm could overcome any deficit in actual competence. He leaned over the table, physically inserting his broad shoulders between the investor and his golden daughter. He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound designed to project easy confidence. He told Julian that they did not get bogged down in the microscopic details of the kitchen. He waved his hand dismissively, treating mathematics like a trivial distraction beneath his station. He launched into a rehearsed speech about family dedication. He talked about sweat equity and putting their hearts into the foundation of the community. He attempted to sell a Wall Street financial expert on the concept of homegrown grit. Julian set his pen down on top of his notebook. The polite, professional veneer vanished. He looked at my father with the cold, assessing stare of a predator identifying an incredibly weak target. He informed Richard that sweat equity does not satisfy commercial lenders. He stated plainly that Hart does not cover payroll liabilities. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, set it down on a coaster, and fired his third question. He asked about the zoning variance for the back patio. He noted that the property lines abutted a strict residential sector. He wanted to know the specific decibel limit written into the city permit and what the legal curfew was for outdoor seating. My father froze. His hand was still resting on the tablecloth from his expansive gesture. He had no idea the patio required a separate variance. He had never spoken to the City Planning Commission. He held a fake commercial lease in his home safe, but he did not possess a single shred of actual operational knowledge regarding the building he claimed to manage. He blinked, the robust patriarch facade shattering under the weight of 3 standard business questions. Julian looked from the silent father to the pale daughter. He saw them clearly now. He saw the empty posturing. He saw the glaring lack of substance. The irritation became visible in the tight set of his jaw. He did not tolerate individuals who wasted his time. He reached into his leather briefcase resting beside him. He withdrew a sleek embossed folder and placed it on the white linen tablecloth. He opened it, revealing a finalized term sheet. He picked up his silver pen and tapped it against the heavy parchment. He stated that his firm had already authorized a $5 million wire transfer pending his final physical signature on this document tonight. He turned the document so it faced my father. The numbers were clearly printed, $5 million in Series A funding. He placed his pen down directly next to the signature line. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in his lap. He told them the capital was ready to be deployed into Ironclad Holdings' corporate account by Monday morning. But he stated he would not sign over equity to a management team that could not answer basic operational inquiries. He gave them one final chance to explain their business model. The silence surrounding Table 4 thickened. It bled outward, quieting the patrons sitting at the adjacent booths. The family that had spent the entire month loudly claiming ownership of my life and my property was now completely speechless. They stared at the unsigned contract on the table. It represented everything they wanted, resting just inches from their fingertips, guarded by a wall of facts they could not climb. I watched the scene unfold through the rectangular glass of the kitchen door. The term sheet lay on the table. The pen lay beside it. The silence from Table 4 was absolute. My father was staring at the piece of paper like he was trying to read a foreign language. Chloe was shrinking into the upholstery of the booth, her $900 dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The veneer had completely cracked. They had built a stage they did not know how to occupy, and the audience was demanding a performance they could not deliver. I reached behind my back and untied the knot of my apron. The heavy canvas fell away. I draped it over the stainless steel counter. I did not check my reflection. I did not smooth my hair. I was wearing a plain black t-shirt, chef pants, and non-slip shoes. My arms were dusted with flour and marked with old burn scars. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who worked for a living. I pushed through the swinging doors. The transition from the hot, bright kitchen to the dim, ambient dining room was immediate. The noise level was high, but my focus was narrow. I walked directly toward the center booth. My stride was measured. I did not rush. My father saw me first. The color drained from his face so fast it looked unnatural. He glanced frantically at Julian, then back at me. He stepped away from the table, moving into the aisle to intercept me. He grabbed my elbow. His grip was tight, the grip of a man trying to physically enforce compliance. He leaned down, his voice a frantic, breathy hiss right next to my ear. He told me to get back into the kitchen immediately. He said I was ruining everything. He told me to stop embarrassing the family. I stopped walking. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked up at his eyes. I did not pull away. I did not struggle. I simply held his gaze with a look of absolute, freezing neutrality. The authority he believed he possessed was an illusion, and the illusion was over. I spoke quietly so only he could hear. I told him to remove his hand from my property. My father blinked. The certainty in his expression wavered. For the first time in his life, his oldest daughter was not submitting to his aggression. He slowly uncurled his fingers. I stepped past him, leaving him standing in the middle of the aisle, and approached table 4. Chloe looked up as I stopped at the edge of the booth. Panic flared in her eyes. She reverted instantly to her practiced dismissiveness, trying to salvage the narrative she had spun. She let out a sharp, forced laugh and looked at Julian. She waved her hand at me, adopting the tone of an exasperated manager. She said I was just the cook. She told Julian I was probably confused about a ticket modification and she would handle it momentarily. She turned to me and ordered me to return to the line. Julian Pierce did not look at her. He was looking directly at me. The irritation that had tightened his jaw just moments before vanished entirely. His expression shifted into one of profound recognition and respect. He did not see a hired cook. He saw the architect. He stood up. He bypassed Chloe entirely. He extended his right hand across the table. "Sienna," he said. His voice carried clearly over the low hum of the dining room. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person." The room went dead. The forced laugh died in my sister's throat. Her mouth fell open. My father, still standing in the aisle, turned slowly around, staring at the venture capitalist shaking his daughter's hand. I took Julian's hand. His grip was firm. I thanked him for flying out. I asked him how he found the braise on the short rib. He smiled, a genuine smile, and told me the texture was exceptional. He noted that the hydration ratio of the sourdough was exactly as I had described it in my technical specs. Chloe stammered, her voice pitched high, shrill with confusion. She asked Julian how he knew my name. She asked why he was talking to the kitchen staff about technical specs. Julian released my hand. He remained standing. He looked down at my sister. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a clinical coldness. He informed her that he conducts extensive due diligence before flying across the country. He explained that when he received her initial email claiming ownership of the heirloom, his firm ran a standard background check on the corporate structure. He stated that the property records and the LLC filings clearly listed Ironclad Holdings as the sole proprietor. He revealed that his legal team had been in direct communication with Marcus Vance, the attorney representing Ironclad Holdings, for the past 4 months. He turned his gaze to my father. He clarified that Marcus Vance had informed him exactly who owned the LLC. He knew from day one that Sienna Enright was the founder, the executive chef, and the sole equity holder of the entire operation. He knew Chloe was a fraud. He knew Richard was a figurehead. He let them dig their own graves because he wanted to see how deep the deception went before committing capital. He wanted to evaluate the integrity of the people attempting to broker the deal. The gravity of the situation crashed down on my family in a single, silent wave. The gaslighting was useless. The posturing was useless. They were standing naked in a room full of people, stripped of every lie they had ever told. Julian looked back at the table. He picked up his pen and slid it into his inside pocket. Then, he picked up the finalized term sheet. He held the heavy parchment between his hands. He looked directly at my father. He stated that his firm invests in founders who possess discipline, operational competence, and ethical transparency. He said he does not do business with individuals who forge financial documents, commit intellectual property theft, or attempt to steal credit from the actual talent. He tightened his grip on the edges of the term sheet. He tore the thick document cleanly in half, ripping right through the signature line. The sound of the heavy paper tearing was sharp and definitive. He placed the ruined contract back onto the table. He picked up his leather portfolio, nodded respectfully to me, and walked out of the restaurant. The power dynamic in the room had violently inverted. My family brought me out here to hide me. They ended up exposing themselves. And they were about to realize that the loss of the investment was only the beginning of their ruin. The glass door shut behind Julian Pierce. His footsteps faded down the sidewalk. Inside the dining room, the silence held. The jazz music played softly through the overhead speakers. 85 patrons sat perfectly still at their tables, their forks resting on their porcelain plates. They were waiting for the fallout. It took 5 seconds for the reality to register on my father's face. He looked at the empty space where the venture capitalist had been standing. Then he looked at me. His expression shifted from shock to a deep, dark red. His ego, forged over 3 decades of running a local hardware counter, could not process the humiliation of a public dismissal. He needed to reclaim dominance. He needed a target. He pointed his finger directly at my chest. His voice started as a low growl, vibrating with held breath before escalating into a shout that bounced off the reclaimed wood beams. He announced that I was fired. He ordered me to pack my knives and vacate the kitchen immediately. He stated that I had ruined my sister's life and destroyed our family legacy. He threatened to call every food supplier, every distributor, and every restaurant owner in a tri-state area. He promised to blacklist my name so thoroughly that I would never find work in this city again. He took a step forward, towering over me, using his physical size to demand submission. I did not step back. I practiced the concept of negative space. I let his anger fill the room until it exhausted itself against my silence. I did not raise my voice to match his pitch. I did not defend my actions. My hands rested casually at my sides. My heart rate remained steady. I watched a man who had spent his entire life taking credit for my labor try to fire me from my own property. When his shout finally died down, leaving him breathing heavily through his nose, I raised my right hand. My lead host walked over from the reception stand. She carried the thick manila folder I had entrusted to her before the dinner service began. She handed the heavy envelope to me, nodded once, and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. I held the folder over the center of table 4. I let it slip from my fingers. It hit the hardwood table with a sharp, heavy slap. The sound made Chloe flinch. I reached out and pulled the cover open. I extracted the first stack of paper. It was the original property deed to the building. The county clerk's seal was stamped in the bottom right corner. I slid it across the table until it rested inches from my father's hands. I told him to read the name of the registered owner. He stared at the document. He did not touch it. I did not wait for him to read it aloud. I pulled out the state registration documents for Ironclad Holdings. I placed them next to the deed. I kept my voice low, clear, and projected, so the surrounding tables could hear every single syllable. I stated that Ironclad Holdings was a single-member corporate entity. I informed him that I was the sole managing member. I told him I bought the building 14 months ago with cash. I outlined the boundaries of my ownership. I owned the foundation. I owned the brick walls. I owned the commercial kitchen equipment, the dining room chairs, and the plates resting on the tables. My father blinked. His breathing turned ragged. He pointed a shaking finger at me and stammered his defense. He claimed he held the master commercial lease. He insisted his signature gave him legal dominion over the footprint of the restaurant. I reached into the folder. I pulled out a copy of the 60-page document he had signed at the downtown coffee shop a year ago. I flipped past the addendums and the fine print, opening it directly to the final signature page. I placed it on top of the deed. I pointed to his signature, written in blue ink. Then I pointed to the line directly beneath it, the line designated for the landlord. It was blank. I explained the legal definition of an unratified contract. I told him Ironclad Holdings never countersigned his proposal. I informed him that his lease was nothing more than a meaningless stack of paper sitting in his home safe. I stated that he was not a master tenant. He was not a business partner. He was a guest in my building, and his welcome had officially expired. The color drained from his face for a second time. His mouth opened. He tried to form a word. A justification. A counter-argument. But no sound came out. The gaslighting lexicon was empty. He could not manipulate a county deed. He looked around the dining room. The patrons were watching him. The man who claimed to build an empire realized he did not even own the chair he was sitting on. The heavy metal hinges of the back stairwell creaked open. Mason walked into the dining room. He wore expensive sweatpants and a premium cotton hoodie. He held a laser measuring tool in his right hand. He was oblivious to the heavy tension suffocating the room. He frowned, looking at his phone, complaining loudly that the demolition contractor was not answering his text messages regarding the load-bearing wall upstairs. He stopped at the edge of the aisle, noticing the silent crowd and our father's pale face. I turned my back to table 4. I reached into the manila envelope one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. It bore a red notary stamp and a formal legal header. I walked across the dining room floor. My non-slip shoes made quiet, deliberate sounds against the wood. I stopped in front of my brother. I held the paper out to him. Mason took it out of reflex. He looked down at the bold text printed across the top. Formal warning of commercial trespassing. I informed him that the second floor was legally zoned as a commercial storage and office space attached to a food service facility. I stated that he had moved his personal furniture into a commercial zone without a lease and without my explicit consent. I told him he had not been on the premises long enough to establish legal residency in the state of Illinois. I gave him exactly 24 hours to remove every single item. I promised him that if he attempted to sleep in that commercial space another night, I would bypass civil court entirely and have the police arrest him for criminal trespassing. Mason looked up from the paper. He looked past me, locking eyes with our father. He expected the patriarch to fix the situation. He expected the family shield to deploy, just as it always had when he failed. He waited for Richard to step forward and override my authority. But Richard was still staring at the blank signature line on the fake lease. Chloe was staring at the torn term sheet resting next to her untouched water glass. The golden child was holding a formal eviction notice, standing in a room full of strangers, realizing that his safety net had vanished. They were entirely stripped of their power. They were silenced by undeniable legal proof. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy their delusion. I just needed to show them the paper. The physical eviction was complete. The trap upstairs was fully loaded and waiting to snap. I walked down the metal staircase to the ground floor, my boots ringing against the steel grates. The quiet preparation was over. It was time to focus on the dining room. Because while Mason was busy measuring the walls upstairs, Chloe was busy trying to sell my restaurant. And Julian Pierce was scheduled to arrive for dinner on Friday night. There was no physical fight. There was no screaming match. When you remove the oxygen from a room, the fire does not rage. It simply suffocates. My father stared at the blank signature line on his useless lease for a long time. Then, without saying a single word to me, he turned around and walked toward the front entrance. Chloe followed him, her designer heels clicking unevenly against the hardwood. Mason was the last to leave, still clutching the eviction notice. The heavy front door swung shut, and the dining room returned to the soft hum of jazz and the low murmur of paying customers. I picked up the torn pieces of the $5 million term sheet, threw them in the nearest bus tub, and went back to my kitchen. Service continued. The 24-hour window outlined in the trespass warning expired at exactly 8 o'clock on Saturday night. I knew Mason would try to call my bluff. In his worldview, deadlines were negotiable suggestions. He assumed the family dynamic would eventually override the legal system. He was incorrect. At 11:45 that night, I pulled up to the curb outside the restaurant. I was not alone. I was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers from the local precinct. I handed the lead officer the recorded commercial deed and explicitly stated that the intruder had been on the premises for less than 48 hours, entirely preventing any legal claim of tenant residency. We walked up the metal staircase to the second floor. The officer knocked heavily on the door. Mason opened it wearing silk pajamas. His custom standing desk was fully assembled in the center of the room. His dual monitors were glowing. He looked at the police officers, then at me, his face twisting into a mask of indignant confusion. The lead officer did not ask for his side of the story. He asked for his identification, verified his name against the paperwork, and informed him that because he was occupying an unpermitted commercial zone and had not established 30-day legal residency, this was a criminal matter, not a civil dispute. The officer gave him exactly 60 minutes to vacate the premises, or he would be placed in handcuffs for commercial trespassing. My parents arrived 20 minutes later. They did not come with a moving truck. They came in my mother's sedan. The arrogance that defined my father just 3 days prior was entirely gone. He looked aged. He looked small. Under the bright, sterile glare of the police flashlights, the illusion of the Enright family empire was reduced to a frantic, humiliating scramble. I stood in the doorway and watched them dismantle the Golden Child sanctuary. There were no cardboard boxes this time. There was no time for careful packing. My mother was forced to stuff Mason's custom-tailored suits and linen shirts into heavy-duty black garbage bags. My father struggled to carry the heavy dual monitors down the metal stairs, his breath catching in his throat. Mason gathered his expensive grooming products, his face flushed dark with shame, refusing to make eye contact with the officers supervising his exit. I did not offer to help. I did not offer them a grace period. I watched my family carry trash bags full of their entitlement out of my building, loading them into the trunk of a sedan in the middle of the night. At exactly 12:45, the officer handed me the silver key I had given Mason. I locked the deadbolt. The eviction was conclusive. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift and methodical. I directed Marcus Vance to send a formal cease and desist order to Chloe, accompanied by a drafted civil complaint detailing her federal wire fraud and intellectual property theft. She was given a choice. She could either sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement permanently prohibiting her from ever mentioning my name or my business, or she could face a lawsuit that would bankrupt her and likely result in criminal charges. She signed the agreement within 24 hours. Her social media accounts went dark the next day. Richard faced a different kind of ruin. The story of the venture capital dinner did not stay confined to table 4. Restaurants run on gossip, and the servers who witnessed the collapse of his facade talked. The narrative bled into the local community. It reached his country club. It reached the vendors at his hardware store. The men he used to buy drinks for stopped returning his phone calls. He was no longer the successful patriarch managing his daughter's restaurant. He was the man who tried to steal his own child's property and got escorted out by the police. To finalize the separation, I had Marcus issue a permanent formal trespass order against all 3 of them, barring them from coming within 500 feet of the property line. The restaurant flourished in their absence. The air felt lighter. The kitchen ran with a new, uninterrupted rhythm. 3 weeks after the midnight eviction, I flew to New York. I took an elevator to the 42nd floor of a glass high-rise in Manhattan. I sat in a leather chair across a polished oak desk from Julian Pierce. There was no fake social media manager. There was no hardware store consultant. It was just me, the numbers, and the investor. We discussed the expansion model for 2 hours. He appreciated the clean ledger. He respected the ruthless efficiency I demonstrated in removing toxic liabilities from my operational footprint. Before I left the office, I signed a private, restructured syndication deal. The capitalization check was not for $5 million. It was for 7. I flew back to Chicago that night, but I did not go up to my apartment. I walked into the dark, empty dining room of the Heirloom. The chairs were stacked on the tables. The exhaust hoods in the kitchen were powered down. I sat down at table 4, the exact booth where Julian Pierce tore a $5 million term sheet in half, and I listened to the quiet. People often assume that cutting off your family brings an immediate sense of victory. They expect a triumphant parade. The reality is much quieter, and it carries a distinct type of grief. You do not mourn the people you cut off. You mourn the parents you deserved but never received. You mourn the brother who could have been a partner instead of a parasite. You mourn the sister who could have been a friend instead of a rival. But as I sat there in the dark, I thought about a concept in visual design called Ma. It is the mastery of empty space. It is the deliberate gap that gives a subject room to exist. For 31 years, my life was filled with their noise. Tonight, I sit in the center of my own property, and I finally understand the power of the void. Removing them did not leave a hole. It left room to breathe. I stood up and walked toward the front glass doors. I turned off the remaining ambient lights, plunging the dining room entirely into darkness. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and locked the deadbolt. The metal clicked into place, a definitive mechanical sound. I am Sienna Enright. I own my space, I own my business, and I own my future. If you were forced to choose between your family's approval and your own survival, what would you choose? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for listening to Sweet Karma Life, and I will see you in the next story.